Sirius XM Patriot 125. The heartbeat of conservatism.
Karl Marx is rolling in his grave. The Wilkow majority.
All right, as promised, joining me in studio is former ambassador of Israel to the United States, Michael Oren, and we're going to talk about his new book, Ally: My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide. All right, so let's start with this. You were raised in the United States.
I was.
New Jersey.
Yes.
So you're a nice Jewish boy from New Jersey.
I don't know if I'm Jewish boy from New Jersey. We're sitting in a studio in New York, and I just pointed out the window. You see those hills over there? I grew up in those hills.
What percentage of the Israeli population is originally from the United States?
There are about 240,000 former Americans in Israel.
That's why I guess it makes it so easy for someone like me to talk to someone like you about Israeli versus American politics, because I think very few Americans understand the Israeli political system. We have a two-party system with factions inside. How many parties does Israel have?
We have multiple parties, and during the recent campaign, I'm in Knesset. I'm a member of our Congress. Many Israelis would say, "Well, let's have a two-party system. Why do we need so many parties?" And I would say, "Listen, I just came from almost 5 years in Washington. There's two parties, but they're not getting a lot done because of the polarization. In Israel, we have multiple parties. We've got right-wing and radical right-wing, left-wing, radical left-wing. We've got the only legal Communist Party in the Middle East. We've got Arab parties. We've got Islamic parties. And we pass more pieces of legislation than just about any other parliament in the world."
Where does the line get drawn with security and defense of Israel? Is it the far right, the far left? I mean, it seems like most of the parties are committed to the safety and security, but I know you have fringe groups. Where do you start to see where people are more for open borders or a willingness to give more land to get peace, and you've given land and haven't gotten peace? Where do you see the factions that are not as committed to security and defense?
Well, you're looking at, as you said, there's fringes on the radical right who don't want a two-state solution. They don't want to see the creation of a Palestinian state. You got people on the left who don't even want a Jewish state. They don't want Israel. We got a big segment of our parliament who won't stand up for the national anthem because they don't believe in the state. It's kind of hard. Imagine people in Congress not singing the Star Spangled Banner. We have that. But in Congress, you got it. But there's a solid block in the middle that says the following: listen, we don't think it's easy to get a Palestinian state. Right now, we've had terror all week. Two wonderful couples, people killed brutally. And we had this couple, by the way, an American citizen, Tom Henkin, was shot with his wife in front of their 4 kids, repeatedly shot. So that has a big impact on Israeli opinion. So people are not thinking necessarily peace right now. They're thinking more security. But if you give them the choice and you say to them, listen, if we do have peace, it's going to be a real peace, and it's going to give you security, and they're willing to go very, very far. The fact that we've been through everything we've been through since the year 2000, we've been targeted by 20,000 terrorist rockets that have been fired from areas from which Israel withdrew in southern Lebanon and Gaza. 1,000 Israelis killed by suicide bombers, including my sister-in-law. You can read about in this book. The amazing thing, at the end of the day, you take a poll. The majority of Israelis are still in favor of the two-state solution, still in favor of peace. That's the extraordinary thing here.
You guys are surrounded by theocracies and factions that are dedicated to your destruction. I want to read a quote directly from Ally. Most recruits no doubt feel jittery when first putting on the uniform, buttoning up the epauletted shirt with the Sahal, the Hebrew acronym for the IDF, stitched into the breast pocket. I too felt nervous, yet along with anxiety was the pride of becoming the first Jewish army in 2,000 years. This was the answer to exile, to the Holocaust. Compulsory military service. That's not something we've had in the United States since 1972. What was it like to go from the United States to Israel to know full well that you were going to have to serve in the military?
Well, first of all, on one hand, as I say, it was jittery. It's scary putting on that uniform the first day. It's scary taking orders for the first time. And it's scarier still when you go through training. I was a paratrooper. I went through 17 months of training, and then you go off to battle. You actually find yourself in war, and someone you've never met and never will meet just trying to shoot your head off. And, that's a hard one. I went through several wars, and my kids went through wars. My eldest son was actually wounded in a war. All that is scary. On the other hand, it's a tremendous sense of pride. Yes, you are a soldier defending the first Jewish state in 2,000 years. The Israeli army is very different than the American army, Andrew. My father was a career soldier in the American army. It's all about saluting and rank and sir and yes, sir, and a lot of marching.
Discipline.
We don't salute. We don't march. We call all of our officers, even our generals, by their first names. Usually by their last names or their nicknames. It's very different, very different. And then once you finish the compulsory service, then you spend many years in reserve duty. And at one point in my life, I was doing at least one day a week of active reserve duty, so much so that I didn't even bother signing out in a rifle. I kept it at home. I kept my M16, the home M16, because it would just save time. And then you'd go away. You'd leave your family and go off and fight somewhere for 2 weeks, and then come back and try to lead a normal life. What's transpired over the more recent years is that the war has come to us. There was a time when we...
But hasn't it always been... I mean, when we think about our troops, we think about deploying to Iraq, Afghanistan, before that, Iraq or Kuwait, before that, Vietnam, or small stints in Central America or Grenada. You've always had the war right at your border.
Right at our border, but still it wasn't in our backyard. And what's happened now, increasingly since 2005, since Israel withdrew from Gaza, and Gaza became a terrorist stronghold, because we withdrew to Gaza to make peace. We didn't get peace. We got rockets, thousands of rockets. So you're holding my book. Part of that book was written while I was sitting in a bomb shelter because my neighborhood was under rocket fire. Now that is a weird concept to wrap your head around in the United States, that we would be sitting in this radio studio and all of a sudden a siren go off and we have to run for a bomb shelter. In Israel, it happened.
The book is Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide. Michael Oren is joining us in studio, former ambassador of Israel to the United States. Do you think there's a naivete with the way many Americans look at Israel? Because land for peace, it sounded like such a great idea, right? It would just give them the piece of land that they want and everybody will get along. Immediately, it was like the tanks or the rockets or whatever it just moved that much closer to civilian populations. And here in the United States, we love to rally around the concept of protected class status. We're always looking for the victim and the oppressor. And now the hot group to be seen as the victim is Muslims. So in a lot of Americans' minds, liberals, college kids, academics, politicians, well, we have to do this thing on behalf of the victim to make the world a better place. Turns out these people aren't so much the victim.
Well, in fact, Israel's the ultimate victim. We are surrounded by, several hundred million people who want to destroy us, and that's just in our immediate neighborhood. It gets bigger if you take along the entire planet. And sometimes it's difficult to get that perspective, because what you see a lot on the news here is the situation in the West Bank, where the Palestinians are easily perceived as victims. But, if you zoom out, you're going to see a very, very different picture. That is Israel that is facing right now Iran, for example, with 70 million people. We're only 8 million people. And Iran is moving troops into Syria, which is along our northern border. They're attacking in Iraq, which is a 6-hour drive from Jerusalem. These aren't big distances. Where I live in Tel Aviv is a 2-hour drive from ISIS. And you tell me who's the victim here, Israel or ISIS? You got to zoom out and see the bigger picture. That's how we see it. We don't see that little sliver you get on the news every night.
Well, I do want to ask you about the Iran deal and Russia and Syria, but I do want to get to this because it seems like Israeli politicians are not free from the sewers of American politics. The leftist Haaretz newspaper claimed that Benjamin Netanyahu had been describing Rahm Emanuel and senior White House advisor David Axelrod as self-hating Jews. Did he do that?
He did not. Well, one of my first jobs as ambassador was to call Rahm Emanuel and to call David Axelrod and say that I know Haaretz said this, but it's not true. And the Prime Minister has instructed me to tell you personally.
Well, how else would that have come to light if not for someone in the Israeli Knesset trying to leak this to make Netanyahu look bad the way we do this in Washington, or somebody in Washington floating this just to make Netanyahu look bad the way we do things here every day.
Isn't it wonderful how that happens? You're sitting down, which is very good, because I'm going to tell you something shocking. Not everything you read in the newspaper is true.
What?
And certainly not everything you read in an Israeli newspaper
we
is true.
reserve that for the internet. Everything, not the newspapers, but the internet.
It's true. In this case, it wasn't true. And I've spent many, I don't know, not just dozens, hundreds of hours with the prime minister, and that's just not his tone at all. So I understood it fully, and that was my first instruction, to tell him it ain't so.
All right, so let me put the book down for a second and ask you about the Iran deal. The president said this was what was needed to prevent war. John Kerry said the same thing. Hillary Clinton, oddly, in 2007, when she spoke at the Waldorf Astoria to AIPAC, said we cannot, we shall not, we will not let Iran get a nuclear weapon. Now, all of a sudden, she supports the deal, which is pretty amazing. We saw the president draw the red line in the sand with Syria. He followed it up with basically nothing. The Russians have now stepped into the void in Syria, and ISIS has been on the move since we decided to tell Bashar al-Assad how to fight his rebels. So on one side, we've got the rebel movement growing, and now we've got the Russians moving in, and the Iranians are going to get nuclear weapons. This seems like an impossible situation now for Israel.
It is not an easy situation at all. Unfortunately, this notion that it was either this deal or war, the only people who were persuaded by that argument were parts of the American public. The Iranians were never persuaded of that. The Iranians never believed that there was a credible American military threat. Israelis didn't believe it. Nobody in the Middle East believed it. And that's why you didn't get a better deal. If the Iranian leadership understood that they were paying a heavy price for their nuclear program, but at the end of the day they weren't going to get a bomb because they were going to get bombed, you would have gotten a better deal. So there was no credible military threat. And you see the result. It's not just the result with the bad deal. You see it in Syria. You see now the Russians have taken advantages. The Iranians, they're not even waiting for the ink on this deal to dry, and they're already moving troops into Syria.
Didn't we want? Wasn't Obama's big thing that we were going to make the Iranians the ally in the fight against ISIS? Except we didn't step into the. Hey, look, if you want to be a non-interventionist, you don't draw red lines. You say come what may. But he did draw the red line. We didn't follow it up. The Syrians went to Russia, but now if Iran is going to be an ally in the fight against ISIS, backing up Assad, that means Russian weapons are probably going to freely flow into Iran because they're going to need weapons to fight this fight.
And there's a report today that those weapons are flowing already. But listen, who are the Iranians fighting in Syria? They're not fighting ISIS. They're fighting the rebels. And some of those rebels are actually allied with the United States of America. So you now have a deal with Iran, which turns around and cuts a deal with Syria to back up Assad to fight America's allies in Syria. That's what's happening. And again, you got to zoom out. I hate to belabor the term, but zoom out. You mentioned the chemical weapons red line. This is in September of 2013, ancient history, right? And the president said he would react militarily if the Syrian regime used chemical weapons against its own population. And Assad did it again and again. Civilians. Never mind rebels. These are people living in neighborhoods. He bombed neighborhoods with chemical weapons. We were tracking this for months. He did it again and again and again. And finally, yes, as you said, the Obama administration opted for a diplomatic solution or a partial diplomatic solution rather than sending a military message. Now, you can debate whether one had preference to the other, but in the world, it looked like an American retreat. Perception is very important in diplomacy. 3 months after the United States reacted the way it did to the red line, which is to say didn't react militarily, the Russians moved into Crimea. The Chinese moved into the South Chinese Sea.
Yeah, they're building islands.
Because why? Because they're internalizing that that the worldview of the president doesn't include projecting military strength. And they can get away with it. So the United States cuts a bad deal with Iran. I don't know how you want to spin it here, but the Russians internalized that it was a sign of weakness, and they moved their troops into Syria. So the world is not divided into nice, neat geographical units. It's a global situation, and the Russians are leading it globally, and so do the Chinese, and probably some very bad organizations are reading it this way too.
Is there a truth here that if you threatened, it would have been different had the president threatened Syria with a sanction and then delivered a sanction, or a diplomatic sanction and delivered a diplomat. It's different when you threaten a military reaction, but you try to deliver diplomacy, right? You can't say to Assad, there's going to be a military consequence. Oh, wait, we're going to try to, as you said, to make this diplomatic. You threaten diplomatic, you deliver diplomatic. You threaten military, you deliver military. And he did the opposite. And I think, from where I sit behind this microphone every day, that this president is purely academic in these things, that he thinks that he could say certain things in public and forget about them, set it and forget it. It's all theoretical, doesn't have to get off the page to make sense to anyone, but other people hear his words. And as you said, once he didn't follow up with his threat, it just said, well, have at it. This president is not going to do what he says.
Well, I'm going to be sort of counterintuitive here and explain to you what I think was the president's thinking at the time, because I was in Washington and interacting with the White House. And that is that, first of all, this proposal about removing the chemical weapons diplomatically from Syria was an Israeli proposal. We saw that the Russians and the Americans, as they say in diplomacy, had climbed up a high tree, and we wanted to give them both a ladder and take it out. It was clear that the United States wasn't going to act militarily. This was the best of a bad situation. But the president turned to the Congress, if you remember, and said, I'm not going to act militarily unless I get congressional approval. And I think that he did this thinking that the Congress was going to rubber stamp the action, but it turned out the phone started ringing in both houses and both parties. And public opinion in the phone calls was running between 100 against military action to 1 in favor, to 600 against to 1 in favor. And this was in both houses and in both parties. So you can't put it all on the president. Part of it's the American people. It's their war weariness. They don't want to get involved in the Middle East again. They saw Iraq.
They also don't trust Obama's commander-in-chief. There's a lot of people who feel that the Democrats, after the Iraq invasion, when public sentiment turned against it, they turned with it instead of staying with the president after they voted for it. And that includes Biden and Hillary.
I think there's something to be said for leadership, even in the face of public opinion. If you believe in something very deeply, you make your case to the American people. And I think the American people are an open-minded and very reasonable people, and you can make your case. But no one was willing to make the case at the time, and no one's making the case now about Syria. Secretary of State Clinton, then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, then head of the CIA David Petraeus, some serious individuals. You may disagree with them politically, very serious individuals, and the state of Israel. Starting in the latter part of 2011, the Syrian civil war broke out in March of 2011. We all came to the White House and said the same thing. America has to have some skin in this game. America has to be there, because if America's not there, the message is going to get out to all the bad guys, and there's going to be a vacuum in Syria, and that vacuum is going to be filled with bad organizations and bad actors. And we suggested that the United States create a no-fly zone, that the Syrian planes couldn't attack, they couldn't barrel bomb their civilians. Create a free zone where the refugees wouldn't have to go to Europe, they could stay in Syria and be protected by U.S. forces. That was rejected, and to the best of my knowledge, it's still being rejected today.
No, we are not going to see an end to this migrant crisis anytime soon.
You will not.
I mean, we have been focusing on how Germany has been confiscating property, arresting people who are posting on social media, but that's a different topic for a different day. I got to wrap it up here. The book is Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide. Michael Oren, thanks for joining us in studio, former ambassador of Israel to the United States. We're right, they're wrong. That's the end of the story. The arguments on this radio program cannot, will not, will never be broken. Sirius XM Patriot.